Okay, we were just about done with the second chapter of Zephaniah, and where it was discussing God's judgment on the day of the Lord against the enemies of Judah. And we had talked about some of the specific nations around Israel, Judah, that were a thorn in their side for their entire time from when they took up the Promised Land. And it's something that is because of their own inaction against these nations. And we read that God had told them and warned them, right? In Numbers 33, we read that God told them that they needed to drive out all of these nations completely, wipe them out, get rid of them, and if they didn't, they were going to have problems with them throughout their entire time there. And then later, and then we also read in Judges where they failed to do so. And so it's at this point in time that God is exacting judgment on these nations that have mocked him and oppressed his people and done opposite of what his will was. Also, we didn't mention Assyria, and that was also in this group. And the judgment of Assyria is the answer to a plea posed by Hezekiah when he tore his clothes and sent a request to Isaiah to offer up a prayer for the remnant. You can read about that in 2 Kings 19:4. Steve made a comment at the close of our class, basically a reminder that there are no kingdoms of men that can stand without God allowing them to exist, and that all nations, all power resides with our Lord and his providential directives. Our purpose, while on earth, regardless of geography or time or the circumstances that we're here, has been established and expressed very well in Ecclesiastes 12:13, where we've all read this many times, but the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God, keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. So regardless of what's going on in the world around us, or was going on at that time, their first and primary responsibility was to obey God, individually and collectively, as the chosen people that God was working with at this time, which they failed to do. Anything before we move on? Okay, let's go to chapter 3, and we'll read the first 4 verses of chapter 3. Woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the tyrannical city. She heeded no voice. She accepted no instruction. She did not trust in the Lord. She did not draw near to her God. Her princes within her are roaring lions. Her judges are wolves at evening. They leave nothing left to the morning, for the morning. Her prophets are reckless, treacherous men. Her priests have profaned the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. So it's talking about specific groups of people that are part of Jerusalem, part of the leadership of Jerusalem and of Judah. Now, do all of these groups, the princes, the judges, the prophets, the priests, did God specify how he expected them to act, or was it just kind of left up to them to decide how they should act and what they should do? Answer to that is he was very specific with all of these different groups. And before we talk about each of them, I want to read just a little bit that shows that God had told these groups what he expected of them. So if you all want to turn to Deuteronomy and follow along, you're welcome to. I'm going to read through these verses pretty quickly before we make comment. So when we're concerning the princes or the kings, the leaders, Deuteronomy 17, chapter 14 through 20. 17, 14 through 20. I'll read these. When you come to the land that the Lord your God has given you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a book, a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of his law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right or to the left hand, so that he may continue long in his kingdom and his children in Israel. So that's what God expects from the kings and the leaders. What we read about here, how are they described? Roaring lions. What kind of attributes would you put with a roaring lion? Are they worried about anything else around them? Do they see and have compassion and pity on any other animal or creature around them? No. They're aggressive. They're violent. They're self-serving. And are these qualities that match up with what God expected of this group? No, not at all. In fact, it's just the opposite. Judges. What does he expect from the judges? Let's go to Deuteronomy 16. Verses 18 and 19. You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality. And you shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. How are the judges described in Jerusalem by Zephaniah? Wolves at evening, leaving nothing left till morning. What kind of attributes would you apply to what it's saying about these judges?
They're opportunistic. They view their position as a unique ability to take advantage of other people, and they don't leave anything left. Instead of viewing their position as a God-given responsibility to ensure that no one is taken advantage of.
Greedy. Showing greed. And again, showing self-interest. Being very selfish and inward-looking. Which is opposed to what God expects from these judges. And you could see how that could easily be taken advantage of, that position, if you had an unethical person. Because they're in this position to judge, and if they are not righteous judges, they can cause all sorts of evil Prophets. Do you expect anything from prophets? Deuteronomy 18, verses 18 through 20. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not listen to my words, that he shall speak in my name, I myself will require of him. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. How are they described by Zephaniah? Reckless, treacherous men. What does that say about these prophets and their position that they've been put in? If they're to exclaim teaching and a message that pertains to the service of God, if they presume to make up their own messages that serves themselves, then they're deserving of death. And we're told that in what God expects from them. They're impulsive, they're deceptive, and they also are serving self-interest. DJ.
Yeah, all three of these are supposed to be roles of service and servitude to a group of people, and sometimes people desire them for power, and so they have their own motive going in there. And then, kind of like Jeremiah says, they see opportunities that just because you can doesn't mean you should. But if you go in there with a desire for power and your motives are wrong, then those roles can lead to great corruption and danger. But they're supposed to be selfless roles, service roles. And if they are for the benefit of the people, then that's going to take care of a lot of issues. But sadly, a lot of those roles are filled with people that want power for all of history.
Exactly, and they're without excuse. They've been told specifically how they're to act, and they're, whether it's by willful ignorance or lack of knowledge that they have not looked into these matters, they've not seen the importance. None of those excuse them from their actions of wickedness. How about the last group there mentioned was the priests? Was God specific? This is an obvious question too, but was God specific in how he wanted the priests to conduct themselves and what to wear and how to act themselves and who to marry? And very. We can read in Leviticus 21 and 22 and other places, Deuteronomy, that talks primarily about the priests being holy and set apart and sanctified, and not to profane things that are pertaining to the service of God and the people in their worship. They're supposed to be set apart for their service and worship. These men are supposed to be handling God's word with care and reverence and deference to self. But instead, they've made common that which is supposed to be sacred. And that's what Zephaniah says about the priests, that they have profaned the sanctuary. You know what profaned means? You know what that word means, profane?
Common.
It means to make common. So it takes something that's supposed to be sanctified and holy and makes it common. And when we're talking about things pertaining to God, it's beyond insulting to God to do that to him, to make him common in any way at all. And the last thing it says is they did violence to the law. That's really descriptive. There are other ways that you could have put that. They didn't follow the law, they didn't read the law, weren't accurate with the law. But the Spirit of God chose to put that in this way. They did violence to the law. What do you think that means? How can you do violence to words? What can you do to do violence to God's laws?
For the ones that were supposed to be teaching it and upholding it, they were not doing that. They were changing what it was. It was like these other groups that we talked about, that where they should have been selfless, they were selfish and had changed it.
What if you leave a section out? What if you chop out a section? Don't like this. This is not convenient. Let's get rid of this. That's not part of it. Or I'd rather it be worded this way. So I'm going to manipulate these words of God that are very clear, maybe so they'll be accepted, in an easier way. Any changing of God's law, any misuse of God's law is violence towards those words that He has given to us. Scott?
God determines the greater good, and we can read that through His Word. And we're living in a time where a lot of your movies and even the media justifies, like we watched a crazy show a while back where at the end you find out that this couple had stolen a baby, when it was an infant. But the moral of the movie was that was okay because they gave that baby such a better life than what it would have typically had if it had stayed where it was at. You just see it so often. It's okay to steal if you're hungry. The man is starting to try to determine, or has always determined, what they think the greater good is. And it's just not that way.
No, situational ethics, taking away from the foundational truths that are there, saying that there is no absolute truth. It's something that we can change to fit fit whatever the circumstances are.
The description in this chapter, Zephania 3, to me, is that evil had become institutionalized in this society. It didn't matter what area you looked at. The priests, the kings, the judges, they're all corrupt.
Categorically,
And
top
it
to
was
bottom.
just and the only righteous one was God. And God said, I'm gonna fix this. And indeed He did.
Yes. Jeremiah, sorry. You're in my periphery there. I can't see you. Throw something at me.
I think that it's easy for us to forget that it's not just a law, it's a covenant. And we use that interchangeably sometimes, but we study, especially in Hosea, but there's been that language throughout the prophets of this marriage covenant between God and His people. And, when you are unfaithful to your spouse, it's more than just, okay, technically I didn't live up to what I said verbally in front of all those people. It's a complete, violence to the relationship. It's a betrayal. And in Malachi, we'll see that God hates divorce and covers one's garment with violence. And that's essentially what happens when His people decide to corrupt His law. And we talked about last class how they had, engaged in an intertwining of idolatry with the faith of the Jews that God had given them. And, that was violence to that marriage covenant. They had committed adultery in that regard, and the priests were, one of those that were guilty in leading the people in that direction.
Very, very good point. Moving on to verses 5 through 7 in chapter 3. The Lord is righteous within her. He will do no injustice. Every morning He brings His justice to light. He does not fail. but the unjust knows no shame. I have cut off nations. Their corner towers are in ruins. I have made their streets desolate, with no one passing by. Their cities are laid waste, without a man, without an inhabitant. I said, surely you will revere me, accept instruction. So her dwelling will not be cut off, according to all that I have appointed concerning her. But they were eager to corrupt all their deeds. So this is a revisiting of God's unchanging character. God is righteous still in the midst of wickedness, wicked people. He doesn't change. He's not moved by that. His standards are not lowered. He remains the same throughout all situations and all time. Each day, God's truth is made evident and His principles are confirmed. There's never a time, there's never a situation where the things that the principles of God are shown to be false without merit. No failure exists in God in His statutes. God's promised judgment on the nations has already been witnessed by the people. There's nations that He has completely destroyed. Sodom and Gomorrah. He's delivered them from Egypt. They've had wars and campaigns throughout their history where God has delivered them in situations where it wasn't by their strength and their might. He gave the promised land into their hands. He's been faithful with His promises and with His words to them. God expresses His disgust and disappointment that His people, even with all the confirmation of His power, that He was faithful to and loved them. They were in a covenant relationship, a deep relationship, more so than just, like Jeremiah mentioned, the law, the words. It was a deep relationship that God had with His people. He chose to work with these people. And they've turned their back on Him. His promises, prophecies, they were shown to be true, yet He was rejected and put at the very back of their priorities. And they were even, not only did they reject God, but they were eager to corrupt all their deeds. So this is a turning their backs completely on God. Turn over to Proverbs. When it said eager to corrupt all their deeds, it brought this passage to my mind. Proverbs chapter 6. Verses 16 through 19, something that we're all familiar with. There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to Him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil. That's what reminded me in this Zephaniah where he says they're eager to corrupt all their deeds. A false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. How many of those do you think are going on in Judah right now? All of them? We can read about all those things going on. So these things that the Lord, that are an abomination to the Lord, His people, are eager to fall into all of these sinful, wicked things. DJ.
In this section,
not a respecter of persons. It's through our character and our deeds that puts us in an acceptable relationship with the Lord in obedience. These Jews had a lot of pride, and that's kind of a characteristic that carried through and was talked about throughout. And God wants them to be humble, full of humility, to see that they in and of themselves are not special. It's God's covenant with them that makes them special. Let's go ahead and read verses 8 and 9. Therefore, wait for me, declares the Lord, for the day when I rise up as a witness. Indeed, my decision is to gather nations, to assemble the kingdoms, to pour out on them my indignation, all my burning anger, for all the earth will be devoured by the fire of my zeal. When we first read there where it says, therefore wait for me, who is he talking to? It says, wait for me. Is he talking to the faithful remnant? He's telling them that these things are going to happen and to wait, be patient, have faith in the Lord to see the full, what fully happens through this judgment. And then where it says in verse 9, for then, that's after this occurs, I will give to the people purified lips, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord to serve him shoulder to shoulder. What is meant whenever we read about purified lips? What do you think that's talking about? I think purified lips. Go ahead.
Sorry. Speak your language. The language that you're speaking, it's basically the content of what you're saying.
I think it suggests a restoration of communication and fellowship with God, a unification of the faithful to call on God with purified hearts, humble and dedicated to the proper service and glorification of God in spirit and truth. When it says shoulder to shoulder, that also gives the image of people working together toward a common goal, to follow God's laws that had been commanded to them. So it's a renewed dedication decided on by this faithful remnant to work together towards a common goal and a growing together. I've seen the illustration where you have a point that represents God, and then you have a bunch of other points around that center point. And what you notice as these points get closer to the center point, they all become closer to each other. So that unification through God will bring the people together towards that common goal. You may have anything. Jeremiah?
In verse 8, the New King James Version mentions, until the day I rise up for plunder. The ESV says, for the day when I rise up to seize the prey.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite sure where the witness comes from in the New American Standard Bible, but I see in the lexicographers the idea of booty in the sense of plunder, what you take as captive in war. unification of the truth that we saw in Micah 4 in his prophecy that echoes Isaiah 2's prophecy about all these nations are going to come to Jerusalem and beat their instruments of war into instruments of, plowing and working for the Lord's vineyard. And they're going to be together in that and united. And I think also, if you zoom back, you see also a reworking and correction, if you will, of what happened at the very beginning with the Tower of Babel, where there was a united language, and it was used in an effort against God and to exalt man. But this united language will be in a humility of man to exalt God. And so there's a lot of things at play here, for sure.
For sure. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Towards the end, I think in the way I read it, we see more of that foreshadowing, but it's definitely intertwined with all of this prophecy, for sure. Verses 10 through 13. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshippers, my dispersed ones, will bring my offerings. In that day you will feel no shame because of all your deeds by which you have rebelled against me. For then I will remove from your midst your proud, exulting ones, and you will never again be haughty on my holy mountain. But I will leave among you a humble and lowly people, and they will take refuge in the name of the Lord. The remnant of Israel will do no wrong and tell no lies, nor will a deceitful tongue be found in their mouths, for they will feed and lie down with no one to make them tremble. With the purification through this judgment, it makes me think of the human body whenever it's treated for cancer. The treatments are harsh. They ravage the systems of the body. The cancerous cells can only be eradicated by treating the whole body, good cells and cancerous. But through the successful treatment, the healthy cells and systems are left, the cancer is removed, and the body can begin to flourish again. So this process of the day of the Lord and the remnant remaining and the proud, exultant ones being purged out, the wicked nations being taken away, I see that kind of a relationship. In chapter 3, 14 through 18. Shout for joy, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away his judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You will fear disaster no more. In that day it will be said to Jerusalem, do not be afraid, O Zion. Do not let your hands fall limp. The Lord your God is in your midst. He's a victorious warrior. He will exult over you with joy. He will be quiet in his love. He will rejoice over you with shouts of joy. I will gather those who grieve about the appointed feasts. They came from you, O Zion. The reproach of exiles, a burden on them. So they're given this picture of a time of renewal, and they're told at this time they're going to shout for joy. But if you think about it, what truly could cause more thorough joy in a follower, a believer of the Most High God, than God's judgment and wrath being taken away, clearing your vicious and violent oppressors, and God taking up association in your midst, basically approving of you and being part of you. We can read the same kind of language in Psalms 32, when David also shouts for joy concerning the forgiveness that he experienced and his reconciliation with God after he dealt with his sin. And asked for forgiveness and repented of those sins and acknowledged that sin. We have just a few minutes left. If there's any other comments about that, take those. With these last few minutes, let's talk about verse 19 and 20. The prophecy of Zephaniah appears to be twofold. Jeremiah's mentioned this as well, as both a temporal deliverance and a restoration of the faithful remnant of Judah, and also a forward-looking expectation to an everlasting kingdom, this messianic prophecy. Verse 19 says, "Behold, I am going to deal at that time with all your oppressors. I will save the lame and gather the outcasts. I will turn their shame into praise and renown in all the earth." That brings to mind 1 Corinthians 1, 26 and 29, where it says, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God." It must always be evident that all strength and power originates in God and not in man. Verse 20, "At that time I will bring you in, even at the time when I gather you together. Indeed, I will give you renown and praise among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says the Lord." Yes, there's going to be a return from exile after the coming Babylonian captivity, a return of relative independence and rebuilding of the temple. But is there ever going to be a dominant physical kingdom? No. And how do we know that? How do we know that there's not going to be another establishment of Jerusalem and a dominant physical kingdom? Well, we can read in Jeremiah 22:30 that no one is going to rule on the throne of Judah in this world in a physical sense from the line of Ammon. Christ is part of that lineage. So it's not talking about a physical kingdom that is going to be renewed forevermore. The foreshadowing we see is a spiritual kingdom. Isaiah 9, 6, and 7 talks about the prophecy of the coming kingdom. Luke 17, 20 and 21 gives a description of that kingdom at hand. And Ephesians 1, 19 through 21 tells us that everlasting kingdom ruled by Jesus is in place until the end of time. Thank you for your attention. If you have any other questions, want to talk any more about this, come see me. Be glad to talk in more detail about that. Thank you.